All right, good morning. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Silu Huang, who came all the way from Illinois and is absolutely not impressed by what little snow we have here. Silu is a recipient of the MSR PhD fellowship, and she has done a lot of work in different areas, all of it interesting. Today she's going to talk about effective data versioning, but she's also done work while she was interning at Microsoft Research on sampling with probabilistic accuracy guarantees. And she's also done work in the context of AI for selecting the best configuration in which to train an ML model, and more things than I'm even going to mention. So she'll maybe briefly mention some of it, and if you're part of the loop, feel free to talk to her about that later. All right, thank you very much, and I'll hand it over to Sila.
Yeah, thanks for the nice introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm Silu Huang, and I'm a fifth-year PhD student from UIUC. It's my great pleasure to be here and share my thesis work on effective data versioning for collaborative data science. So nowadays, data science is increasingly popular and has been recognized as an emerging field. So in particular, data science has lots of applications in different areas like finance, healthcare, manufacturing, and retail. So how does data science lifecycle look like? Typically, data science starts from task formulation and then acquire data from, say, log systems, followed by data preparation, including like data cleaning, transformation, and then we can try to understand and refine the data through initial data exploration. After gaining a broad picture, we can then further investigate machine learning models. And in order to achieve a good machine learning model, data scientists will typically try to incorporate more new data and try different data preprocessing, as well as feature engineering operators, also different models. After gaining a satisfactory model, we can then deploy it and serve it. And this will in return generate more new data. So we can see this is an iterative process. And during this iterative process, different versions of the same dataset will be generated. So during my PhD study, I'm working towards making data science simpler and more efficient, and spanning many of different stages inside this data science lifecycle, like effective data versioning and automatic data extraction, interactive data exploration, modeling, and AutoML. So I will not have time to cover each of these topics in detail, but in this talk, I will instead focusing on effective data versioning. So as I mentioned, data scientists routinely generate a number of different versions by applying data preprocessing and feature engineering operators. And this is a real example from biological domain, where people are collaboratively construct, curate, and analyze on the protein-protein interaction dataset. Here, protein 1 and protein 2 forms a composite primary key along with some numerical features to indicate the interaction strengths of different sources. And initially, we have version 1. As biologists conduct more lab experiments, new records and columns will be added and lead to a new version V2 here. Simultaneously, some experts can work on their own working copy, correct and curate the dataset, and periodically merge it back to the main line. Also, data scientists can download and analyze on their own working copy, so on and so forth. So we can see this is a nonlinear process with branches and merges. And during this process, hundreds to thousands of versions are generated. So how are these versions managed in each organization? So here I will show how data is managed in some computational biology group at MIT. So typically there is around 20 to 30 students, postdocs and researchers, and with around 100 terabyte data shared via file system. And each terabyte of data is costing around $800 per year for maintenance cost from some local storage provider for unlimited read and write access. And this will amount to around $100,000 per year, which is a large amount for an academic research group. So when some data scientists want to do analysis, then they will first make a private copy and modify and analyze it. and also with ad hoc names assigned to each newly produced version, like dataset v1 here. However, such ad hoc management is problematic, just as shown in this comic. Never look into someone else's document folder. So these versions are simply lying around the share file system, and no one really knows what it is, what it contains, and how they relate to each other. So specifically, from users' perspective, there is no true collaboration. There is no easy way to merge someone else's modification and to share your newly produced result. Also, there is no querying capability to check the dependency or perform some analytics across different versions. From the system's perspective, there is lots of duplications among different versions, and which is a waste of storage. Actually, we are told that the team members are periodically asked to clean up the disk because of the disk and cost constraint. And also, due to the lack of metadata, so there is no easy way to figure out which versions can be deleted and which versions are important. So there is a pressing need for a system to help manage this versioned dataset. There are mainly three desired properties for such a management system. The first is we want to have compact storage to reduce the storage cost. And the second is we want to have efficient versioning capability to enable true collaboration. And last but not least, we want to have data manipulation and analytics to help data scientists to reason about across different versions. So what about some existing version management systems? The first thing that comes to our mind may be the source code version control system like Git. However, it is designed for source code, and it cannot scale to large data sets. Also, it only provides a limited data manipulation and analytics functionality. While temporal database can only support a linear chain of versions. So the question we ask here is, can we make use of the mature relational database and support versioning for the relational database? So in this way, we can inherit much of the same benefits as relational database. For example, the advanced querying capability, the locking and the indexing, etc. And meanwhile, we can provide versioning capability to it. So the rest of my talk is going to be divided into two parts. I'm going to tell you about OrpheusDB, which is a bolt-on approach for structured data versioning. Specifically, I will first show you a demo, and then I will dive into some of the details in developing OrpheusDB. After that, the second part is going to be how OrpheusDB makes certain restricted assumptions, and we try to relax some of the assumptions to make it more general. And these are the two main parts of my talk. After that, I will give you some brief introduction to other works that I have been working on during the course of my PhD, and I will conclude with some future works. So first, I will introduce our built prototype called OrpheusDB for structured data versioning. And this is a joint work with another PhD student, Li Qi, and two master students, and Aaron from U Chicago, and my advisor, Aditya. So here is the overall architecture of OrpheusDB. OrpheusDB is a lightweight layer on top of traditional relational database. And the user can interact with OrpheusDB using version control commands or SQL-like commands. And then OrpheusDB will try to translate the input statement into SQL queries that can be executable in the underlying database. And the underlying database is unmodified, and it is unaware of the concept of versioning. So all the versioning logic is handled inside the intermediate layer in OrpheusDB. So first, let's dive a bit into the query language inside OrpheusDB. First, we can support true collaboration via Git-style commands. So we allow checkout, commit, merge, and diff. Also, we can support advanced querying capabilities to help data scientists to reason about different versions. So here I simply list some of the useful queries that can be asked. For example, the user can ask, can we find the version that is last committed by Alice? Also, can we retrieve the first bad version that contains some erroneous tuple. And in the data science scenario, maybe we want to find the version that is with the highest accuracy in some particular data slice, say in US. And also, maybe we can find the history of a particular tuple. So all this advanced querying capability enables the data scientist to check versions, compare different versions, and identify versions satisfying certain property. So before I dive into the detail, I will first show a demo here. So on the leftmost part, it is a file visualizer where the user can view all the files that are accessible to this user. And in the middle part is where the user can type in SQL-like commands or version control commands, and we will return the result in the bottom part. While the rightmost part is a version visualizer. Here, each node is a version, and the edge encodes the derivation between versions. And in the bottom, there are some of the shortcuts. When you click each button, it will populate the SQL or version control commands here. So I will first show some SQL-like queries. For example, we can view the content of a particular version. And also, we can try to identify versions that have certain property. For example, here, what we want to find is the versions that is with smaller than 100 protein pairs with co-expression interaction larger than 200. So basically, we will submit the button, and we find version 3 and version 4 satisfy this property. Also, we can issue any traditional SQL queries on one version or a set of different versions. Here, we are issuing a group by query. Next, I will show some of the version control commands. So we can first check out a version, and then we will use some external tools to process it or curate it. So here I will modify basically 3 different records and curate them. After modifying it, we can then save it. And we can commit this version back to the system so that others can also visualize it or access it. So we can see here there is a new version pops up, and we can try to compare the difference between versions. And here we can see there are 3 different tuples. And also we can try to see the meta information of this particular version. Okay, so now we have looked at the demo. So I will then dive into some of the details in developing OrpheusDB. So there are 2 major criteria when developing OrpheusDB. The first one is we want to have compact storage. And the second one is we want to have efficient versioning capability. So we want to, in particular, we are focusing on 2 fundamental operators. One is commit, and the other is checkout. So in overall, we have 3 different criteria. One is storage consumption, and commit latency, as well as checkout latency. And these are the 3 criteria when to guide our design choices inside OrpheusDB. So I will start from a Strawman approach here. One naive way is that we can augment each tuple with a version ID, VID here. And then, however, this has 2 major issues. The first one is the storage can be very large. For example, here the first record is repeated twice. So basically, each single record will be repeated as many times as the number of versions it presents in. And the second issue is that the checkout can be very costly because we are wasting time in accessing irrelevant records. So for the first issue, I will come up with an optimized representation scheme. And for the second issue, we will propose a partition scheme for it. Let's start with the data representation. By the way, if you have any question or anything is not clear, you can ask the question. Yeah. I think there are something wrong with the slides. But hopefully, it should be fine. Yeah. So one natural way is that we can combine the same tuples and associate each distinct tuple with a version list, vlist here. So even though array data type is a non-atomic data type, it is commonly supported in databases. So in this way, we can reduce the storage cost. However, the commit can be very costly because if we clone version 3 as version 4 and we commit version 4 immediately back to the system, then we basically need to access every single record that presents in version 4 and append version 4 in each vlist here. So what about some other alternatives? So one other way is we can separate the version information from the data information because they are independent to each other. Here we have a table showing the data table with an augmented record ID. And we need a mechanism to encode the versioning information from the version to the records. So one natural way is we can organize it using based on record ID. And the other way is that we can organize it based on the version ID. So for the first one, it also suffers from costly commit because it is similar to the combined table in the previous slide. But for the second one, when you want to commit a new version, you only need to insert one more tuple here with the version ID and its associated record list. So we eventually choose the split by R list as our data model. And we conduct experiments and verify that split by R list has the best performance in terms of the storage and the commit time. Okay.
Just out of curiosity, right? You ultimately have a physical design problem here. So it not only depends on how you represent the data, but also sort of which index structures you use. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like what did you try out and what works and what doesn't?
So you mean different indexing structure for
because you have a database system underneath everything, right? So you can take advantage of whatever indexing.
Yeah. So we basically. For example, for the data table, we have index on the record ID, and for this versioning table, we also have index on the version ID. And this is to make it faster when we want to do the join between these two tables. And for other like indexing structures, we basically let the users to figure out like which index they want to build on top of the different tables, right?
Do you find that most records are in most versions? I mean, once a record has been introduced, I would imagine it's going to be in pretty much every version from that point on. Some exceptions, but generally. So it seems like you could have a scheme that sort of says, here's the exceptions to that rule. Like here's a list of what versions each record is not in. And then when you commit, it would just automatically be in every version. Did you guys look at anything like that, like making assumptions about how?
We didn't make assumptions on like the patterns of the user in terms of different versions. So basically, we are having like a list of different versions this particular records presents in. But maybe what you mentioned is like we can condense this version list to like a starting point and an end point. And then maybe we can say, oh, it is this range, but maybe one particular version is not inside this range. We didn't consider the compression of the vlist here. Yeah.
So you mentioned about there can be cases where a user wants to add a column or delete a column. So what do you do with this kind of schema change?
Yeah. So in terms of the schema change, how we handle it is as follows. So for example, there is a new version commit in with schema change. If it is only a deletion of some particular column, then we basically have a table recording like each what are the attributes inside this version. And if it is a addition of the columns, then maybe we need to change the schema. So there are two different cases. The first one is we can store it as an additional table or separate table. And the other one is maybe we want to alter the original table. So basically, we can use the alter command inside a database to make it, to do the schema change. Yeah, there are two different options here.
I may have missed this, but what types of queries are you supporting? Do you have?
So we basically support Git-style commands, and we can support SQL-like commands. Yeah. Okay, so recall that. Oh, okay, sorry.
Can you go back to the last slide?
This one.
The next one. Yes, I missed the intuition. Why is split by rlist better in performance?
Yeah, so basically, as we mentioned, we have three different criteria. The first one is the storage, and the second one is commit latency, and the last one is the checkout latency. So in terms of when we want to do these two, the storage, we have mentioned we can reduce the storage by combining the same tuples. And then in terms of the commit, when you need to commit a new version, for the first one, you need to append v4 to each of the single records in the upper part, and you need to do an array appending. And for the second one, when you want to commit a new version, you only need to insert one new record and indicating the version ID and the rlist. So in this way, you basically can reduce the commit time.
So the rlist, how does that encode? Is it actually a list of RIDs?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
is it like a bit?
A list of RID. So we are using the array data type inside database.
So even though that row can be very big, the overall cost is still cheap.
Yes, yes.
So just a clarification, V3 and V4 have the same R lists. Under what condition would that happen? Why is the new version not having any deltas?
Yeah, so basically I'm simply giving a very naive example. So for example, it's you clone a version, but actually you will do some modifications, but I didn't show the modification here. So
The modification would be as a new RID, right? Because you want to preserve the
Yes.
provenance. So
A
it
new
wouldn't be the same
RID.
RID.
New RID. So each record is immutable, and when you do some modification, then you will have a new record ID.
Right.
And
So it's the same record ID here for V4. Shouldn't it be a new RID in the R list?
yes. So here I'm only showing a naive example of cloning one version to another version. Yeah, but if you do some modification, then it will lead to a new RID, and then I will append a new record here in this data table. Right.
But it seems to me that what you gain in your commit improvement, you would lose on at least a certain type of query profile. Like if you're looking at a certain RID and you ask for the entire version history, your split by vlist would be kind of optimal for that query, but your split by rlist would be just as expensive as commit is in some sense.
Yes, that's a good question. So in the current implementation, we are basically considering so prioritize the commit and the checkout operators, and for other operators, we are not that care about it. Yeah, it depends on the workload, right? Okay. So for this one, recall that we have the three criteria. One is storage, and one is commit, and also checkout time. So in the following, I will tell you how we can further optimize the checkout time by a while partition scheme. So as we mentioned, the checkout latency is very large because we are wasting time in accessing irrelevant records. Even with index, since the records are scattered across the table, so hundreds of thousands of random access will eventually be reduced to a full scan. So for example, here, if we want to check out version 5, even if it only has 3 records, we are actually accessing the entire table with 7 records. So how can we eliminate accessing irrelevant records? So what we propose is we can partition the big table into subtables so that we can reduce the checkout latency, but maybe at the cost of some more storage consumption. So we continue the previous example. We can partition the big table into two subtables. The partition 1 will contain all the records that is in version 3 and version 4, while partition 2 will contain all the records that is in version 1, 2, and 5. And now when we want to check out version 5, we only need to access the smaller table with only 4 records. But as a trade-off, we are repeating record 3 twice in these two tables. So we can see there is a trade-off between the storage cost and the checkout time. So we first define what is the storage cost and what is the average checkout cost. So the storage cost is basically the total number of records in all partitions. And the checkout cost for each version is the size of the partition this version belongs to. And the average checkout cost is basically averaging across all different versions. So here comes the problem definition. So given a storage threshold, gamma, we want to find a partitioning scheme such that the storage consumption is within the gamma budget, and we can also minimize the average checkout cost. So we prove that this is an NP-hard problem by a reduction from 3 partitioning problem. And in the following, I will show an approximation algorithm for this. So before we introduce our proposed algorithm, we first look at 2 extreme cases and get some intuition behind this algorithm. So at one extreme case, if we store all the versions inside one single table, then the storage cost will be minimized because each distinct tuple appears exactly once. And at another extreme, if we store each version as a separate table, then we can see the average checkout cost is smallest because we are not accessing any irrelevant records when checking out a version. So if we visualize these two in a plot where the x-axis is the storage cost and y-axis is the average checkout cost, then they are basically lying in 2 corners. And what we want to do is we want to find the optimal partitioning scheme in between, such that the storage is within the budget gamma. And the high-level intuition here is that we can possibly group the versions that are similar to each other together, right? Such that we can only access a smaller number of irrelevant records when checking out a version. And also the storage cost is not increased too much. Yeah, sorry for the figure here. So if we use the traditional clustering algorithm, then it can be very time-consuming because in each iteration, we need to access the total number of records, and the number of records can be as large as 1 billion. So instead, we propose to operate on the version graph. So we can partition across the version graph. As shown in the demo, the version graph basically encodes the derivation information and also indicates the similarity among different versions. For example, version 1 here has 7 records, and version 2 has 8 records, and they have 6 records in between. So in this way, compared to working directly on total number of records, this is very lightweight because the number of versions is much smaller compared to the number of records. Then how about the effectiveness? So as you may have already noticed, if we work on the version graph here, then it is actually exploring a restricted subspace. So for example, there is no way to partition the versions in this way because other versions inside the blue partition is not connected without the inclusion of version 3 in the yellow partition. However, remarkably, even with this restricted search space, we are able to prove some approximation guarantee in terms of the smallest storage cost and the smallest checkout cost, which is good. So we will show the algorithm below. So it is very simple, but it has very strong guarantee. So we first define depth coherent property. So mathematically, what it means is that the current checkout cost is within 1 over delta times the smallest possible average checkout cost. So the indication is that the versions inside this partition are very similar to each other. And our algorithm runs as follows. We start from the single partition case, where it has smallest possible storage cost. And then we will first check whether it satisfies the delta coherent property. So if it satisfies the delta coherent property, then we can stop, because the storage is the smallest, and the current checkout cost is not too far away from the smallest possible checkout cost. Otherwise, we will split this partition, and so on and so forth. So we can prove that this has an approximation guarantee in terms of the smallest possible average checkout cost and the smallest possible storage cost. As an example, so if the delta is set as 0.25 and the max steps along the partitioning process is 3, then we can guarantee that the current storage cost is within 4 times the smallest possible storage cost.
I'm just trying to understand the restriction on the search space. So here's a simple example. Say in each version, I'm adding a record and I'm deleting it. And this is all I do. So I create a chain of versions where every other version is identical to each other. So all the even versions are the same and all the odd versions are the same. So the best storage would be, just 2 versions. So in that case, is it delta coherent? I mean, is there a restricted search space that's only contiguous versions? What are you going to do?
Yeah, so in that case, it's basically in our current partitioning mechanism, we are only having a constrained search space. So which means we are not be able to partition the versions inside like the odd partitions and the even partitions. In that case, I guess our algorithm will eventually be like partition every. So basically, it will have some cut point in between, and then group all the versions inside in like the previous parts inside one particular partition, and then the others inside another partition, right?
So that chain is not delta coherent, or is it delta coherent?
So the delta coherent will basically based on like whether it is whether it satisfies this mathematical equation. So in your case, is I guess if it is only a small chain, then it will be delta coherent. But if it is a longer chain, then it may not be.
But the average will be 1 minus all the other records. So it will be C average is going to be half of n minus 1 over n or something like that.
Yeah. So in your case, you can imagine in this way, right? So basically, if you group like the even version with the odd version, then basically you can see the partition is basically increased a bit, right? Because you are having like some of them are deleted and some of them are added back. So it basically the partition will be the size of like say like the odd partition size, the odd version size. And then when you check out the version, then if the number of odd partition, the number of even partition is very large, then it can possibly violate this delta coherent property. But if you partition them in like 10 versions inside one group, then it should satisfy this coherent property.
We can take it offline.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, then we can guarantee like the storage cost and the average checkout cost. So we can further illustrate this using an example here. So basically, initially, we will store all the versions inside one partition, and then we will check whether it is delta coherent. So for this one, it is not delta coherent. Then we will snip the edge that is with the smallest weight. And we can then result in 2 partitions, and we again check whether it is delta coherent or not. So if it is not, then we will again snip the edge and then result into 3 different partitions. So now each partition satisfies the delta coherent property, then we can terminate. So we further consider this algorithm with, compare this algorithm with 2 existing clustering-based algorithms. One is agglomerative and one is k-means, with some versioning benchmark from previous paper. And we first look at the effectiveness where the x-axis is the storage size and the y-axis is the checkout time. So as an example, this point shows the storage size is around 2.3 gigabytes, and the checkout time is around 2.9 seconds. And we can see as the increase of the storage size, basically we can reduce the checkout time. And also, our proposed algorithm Lifecycle is dominating the other two algorithms. And of the other two algorithms, actually K-means is performing better, and it is quite close to Lifecycle. So next, in terms of the efficiency, so on average, we observe a 3 orders of magnitude speed up compared to 2 clustering-based algorithms. And if you still recall that K-means has very good effectiveness property, but here it can sometimes not be able to finish the algorithm, as shown in this cutoff here. At last, we will show the benefits of partitioning. So again, the x-axis are 3 different data sets. And the red one is the one without partitioning. And the other 2 are with a storage budget. So we can see as we increase the storage twice from 4 gigabytes to 8 gigabytes, we can actually reduce the checkout time dramatically. Any question for the OrpheusDB part? Mm-hmm.
So here you talked about checkout time and the space, right? Have you also done experiments on the query processing time? So if I just run a query on, say, the most recent version, how much overhead does all of this add?
So if you, for example, basically we are optimizing for the checkout time and the commit time. So if, for example, the case you mentioned, like I want to have more workload on the recent version, then it is basically saying we will have a workload on the checkout time, on the checkout cost. So our algorithm can be generalized to the case where we have the workload on different versions. So, for example,
The question was even simpler. I was just saying, I'm running some analysis on my data, right? If I didn't have any versioning, let's say it takes 10 seconds to run the query, how much overhead does all the bookkeeping you have to do?
Yeah, I understand that. So what I mean is like, if you have a workload of different queries on different versions, then you can possibly basically say, I have the workload on different versions. And then in that case, you will basically materialize the latest version and store it as a separate table. And then in that case, when you issue a query, then you can boost your performance.
Okay, so this is like a materialization strategy.
Yes.
Based on the workloads. That's
based on the
what
workloads, yeah.
Just building on something somebody else observed. So it seems like you're geared towards the worst case data versioning. If you actually use it, I mean, you might see something like concentration of records that keep getting changed. That maybe a new record is more likely to change soon, but an older record's probably not changing that often. If you imbibe those things, or you assume that some of the delta, each interversion change is going to be small, is there something else that will actually be better? Or I mean, I'm like in videos and stuff, right? You have iframes, and then you have a lot of delta frames, and then you take another iframe. Would things like that kick in these contexts, or like when you applied this to real data sets?
Yeah,
what did you see? I mean, did you see any such patterns?
I think one possible way is basically saying like instead of so basically you can have a trunk structure, and inside this trunk structure you maybe want to group the similar records all together, and then you do the optimization. But in this one we didn't consider take the patterns into consideration. Yeah.
So, concern about this whole organization that you have chosen of these version IDs and RID lists. I mean, if you had millions of records, for example, right? I mean, how would you do query processing? Because it's just an array of RID lists, and it's very hard for me to imagine how, because you're essentially not using the database any longer as kind of with its built-in indexes and capabilities of capturing or locating records. So isn't it kind of, why not just use like a first-class temporal kind of versioned database or version index, like an interval index or something, right? Which might make it easier to do query processing on the data. So what's your...
So for the first thing is compared to temporal database, it is the version graph is a DAG. So it is not easy to encode them like into a range. Right, so that is the first thing. And the second thing is for the list of versions. So array data type is support. So we are building our system on top of Postgres, and array data type is supported in Postgres. And it is true that array for the array data type, it is not having a very good optimization. Yeah, and we are currently exploring some of the direction of how to rewrite the query in terms of the arrays so that the query process, the query execution can be faster. For example, one naive way is you can unnest the arrays and then do the joins. And another way is, for example, inside Postgres, they are having joins like you can have one record ID and you can try to do a binary search in the array list. Yeah, so there are different mechanisms to handle the array optimizations. And we are currently still exploring how to rewrite the queries so that we can help the optimizer to do the best decision. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Have you considered using any provenance system? Because what you just described, the versioning is like lineage information. It's called with provenance. The denormalization, you're talking about the logical denormalized representation of the provenance graph. And that incurs several overheads. So I was wondering if you're considering any provenance management system for that.
Yeah, we didn't consider the provenance systems yet, but I guess, and especially for this one, actually you can see it is not much of the provenance. So it's basically check the version graph. And then for the records that has primary key, then you can possibly check the lineage of this particular record. But in addition to that, we are only maintaining like some metadata of these particular versions. So I guess it's not very much of really provenance information.
I was thinking about lineage, which is fine-grained, and that means at the RID level, not at the metadata level, so not coarse-grained provenance, but fine-grained provenance. So you have a version, each command is going to be generating a new version. That's the coarse-grained information. The fine-grained information is that from the RID from the input, I went to the RID to the output, and this is going to generate this RID list that you're creating. The RID to V list is going to be the forward provenance, and the V list to the RID list is going to be the backward provenance.
So I guess it's because of the design of our system. So we are allowing the external tools to process the data. So we are actually not be able to check the operations that is done inside one particular version. Yeah. So if we can capture like the different operators and how the records are evolving, then maybe we can use the provenance systems. But in this one, for example, as I shown in the demo, we are letting the users to use some like external tools to handle it. So we are not be able to capture all the provenance information. But it is a good direction, as I was mentioning later, if we can capture all the code and the workload and also the data.
You really want to avoid all these joins from the normalization. You really don't want to do such kind of pre-processing with billions of records going on and doing joins on the normalization. Anyway, we can take this on. We can discuss it.
I have a question. So at the beginning, you talked about this the biology lab, and they had all these versions of the data, and you've really tuned your system for assuming that people are kind of making changes at a data to like adding tuples, removing tuples, manipulating tuples. But some of the examples you gave on that first slide were like, underscore normalization, which I assume maybe they've normalized some whole column or something. So if someone normalizes a column, it's going to double the database, right? It's going to add a whole new set of tuples.
That's a good question. So it depends on how we do the dataset difference. So actually, if for the normalization case, you can consider it as you are adding a new column, right? So you are having two different columns, and then you basically are doing the schema change in our case.
So how do you handle a new column? I guess that would be my question. If someone wanted to add a column, does that double the size of everything? Now you have tuples with and without the column? Or can you mark that column as being there for some tuples and not for others versions?
Yeah. Yeah, so basically, as Byru just asked, so in order to handle the schema change thing, if it is a newly added column, then basically we will have a table that is recording all the attributes that is inside this particular version. And then if there is a new column added, we can do two different things. The first thing is you can choose to create a separate table. And the other thing is you can try to alter this original table. And then basically use the database commands like alter, add a column. Yeah, to handle the schema change.
But would you? So I don't know. I think I missed it. If I have just one entry and now I add a column, would that become two entries? One the original entry and then one with the value in the new column, and each one is versioned in your version table, or do you have a way of having one entry and the version table says one version has this column and the other version doesn't have this column?
Yes. So you will have one entry and then you will have the table recording which attribute is inside this version.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
So you didn't talk about that part in the talk because here we just had row IDs, right?
Yes.
So here
just for simplicity, I only showed like the records, but for schema change, you can refer to the paper. Yeah, we talk about it. Yeah. Okay, then I will go to the second part. So we mentioned that OrpheusDB makes several restricted assumptions. And here we want to relax some of the assumptions to make it more general. So first, I have worked on changing the storage data into the storage representation from the structured data to a more general data formats. And we try to allow a more general traversal language that is beyond SQL. And I also worked on a setting where the user is not starting from scratch. Instead, they want to bootstrap the process that has already been done. So in this talk, I will simply focus on the generalized storage engine, generalized storage representation. So this is a joint work with Shovik, Amit, and Amor from U Maryland, and as well as my advisor, Aditya. So different, as we mentioned, different from OrpheusDB, here we want to deal with different data formats, ranging from structured, unstructured, to unstructured data. And one common thing with OrpheusDB is that we need to balance between the storage and the checkout cost. So one natural question is, can we just use the mechanism inside OrpheusDB, right? So the problem here is that we don't know what is each individual record if we are handling an unstructured data set. And all we have access to is some black box diffing mechanism that can give us delta between versions. So this is the assumption we are starting with, and this assumption is powerful enough to handle different data formats. Therefore, we are using a delta-based approach. What it means is we can either store it, some version in its entirety, or materialize it. And for some other version, we can store it as the modification from some existing version. So what is delta here? The delta can be in different different formats. For example, we can represent using Unix difference, or we can represent it using SQL script. Or for some particular data type, we can even use XOR. Next, we will show how we can represent different versions using this delta-based approach. So for example, there are 3 versions here, and we can materialize version 1 and store the other 2 versions in a linear train as the modification from its previous version. And in this way, the storage cost is basically 100 plus 30 plus 10. So 30 here means the delta between the version 1 and version 2. And when we want to check out a particular version, for example, if we want to check out version 1, because it is materialized, so the checkout cost will simply be 100 megabytes. And for the second version and the third version, we basically need to start from the materialized version and then trace all the way down to this particular version.
So you only care when you talk about the access cost, you only care about the amount of storage that you have to read. You don't talk about the cost of actually applying the diff?
It's a good question. For simplicity, I only show like the case where the storage cost is the same as the recreation cost. But actually, the storage cost can be different from the recreation cost. And we have that in the paper, but I didn't show it here. Right. And alternatively, we can materialize like the version 1 and then store the other 2 versions as the modification from version 1. And we can calculate the storage cost as well as the total recreation cost accordingly. Also, we can materialize version 2 instead of materialize version 1, and then store the other 2 versions as the modification from version 2. So in this way, we can have a smaller storage cost and also a smaller total checkout cost. So we can see there are 2 criteria here. One is storage cost and one is checkout cost. And in the following, I will simply focus on the case where we have the constraint on the storage size, and we want to minimize the average checkout cost. So this is the same as that in OrpheusDB. And next, I will show some of our proposed algorithms. So we first map this problem definition into a graph setting. So here we have 4 versions, and the delta here basically means the edge here basically means the delta between versions. And we will first introduce a null version here, and we will connect this null version with all other versions. And here 25 basically means when the version 1 is materialized, what is the storage cost? Okay. And let's look at one possible storage graph representation. So in this one, what we are saying is we are basically materialize version 1 and version 2, and we are storing version 3 as the modification from version 1, and storing version 4 as the modification of version 2. Okay. So we can see the total storage cost is basically the summation of all the edge weights inside this graph, right? And the checkout cost, for example, if we want to recreate version 3, we basically need to start from this null version and walk along the path from this null version to the version 3. Also, we can observe that this is a tree. The storage graph must be a tree, because in order to recreate one version, we only need one path from the null version to this particular version. Okay. So with these observations, we can then dive into some of the problems. So the first one is, if we only care about the storage size and there is no constraint on the recreation cost, then this can basically be transformed or reduced to a minimum cost arborescence problem, because the storage size is basically the weight sum inside this tree, right? And on the other hand, if we want to minimize the recreation cost and there is no constraint on the storage cost, then this is actually a shortest path tree problem, because the checkout cost for one version is basically the path weight from the null version to this particular version. So what we want to do is we want to balance between these 2 trees. So we want to find a spanning tree that is in between of the minimum cost arborescence and the shortest path tree. Okay. So we propose a local move greedy algorithm where we start from the minimum cost arborescence, which has the smallest storage cost. And then we iteratively add more edges or deltas. In each iteration, we are picking the edge that has the largest ratio between the reduction in the recreation cost and the increase in the storage cost. So let's look at one example here. So this is a spanning tree in the intermediate process. And basically what it means is we are materialize version 1 and version 2, and we are store all other versions as the modification from version 1 and version 2. And we can calculate the ratio for each dotted line. And then we can find the edge between now version and version 4 has the largest ratio. So we will pick this edge and remove the edge from version 1 to version 4. What it essentially means is that instead of storing version 4 as the delta from version 1, we are materializing version 4 instead. Okay. So we compare this algorithm with some other heuristics. One is modified Prince algorithm. Prince algorithm here is basically the famous algorithm to calculate the minimum spanning tree. And the second one is from delay constraint scheduling literature. And the third one is a Git repack heuristic. So again, the x-axis is the storage cost, and the y-axis is the total recreation cost. So we can see as the increase of the storage cost, we are reducing the recreation cost. With the increase of the storage cost, we are reducing the recreation cost. And these two dotted lines are the smallest possible recreation cost and the smallest possible storage cost. We can see with a small increase on the storage budget, we can actually reduce the recreation cost dramatically. So in addition to this problem definition, we also consider different cases varying the optimization goal and the constraint. And also, as Christian mentioned, we consider the case where the delta is basically the storage and the phi is basically the recreation cost. We consider different cases here.
So do you restrict the materialized graph as a tree in all these formulations?
Yes.
Can you prove that's optimal? I'm not sure that's the tree or if you relax it, could you get a better solution?
So basically, the question is whether the storage graph should be a tree, right? So there are cases you may imagine that we don't want to be a tree, that is merge. So if you merge two versions into one version, then you may want to have a DAG instead of a tree. But yes, in this problem definition, we are constraining it to store one version as the modification of only one version instead of multiple versions, right?
Right. Because I wonder maybe it's possible to add an edge to make it not a tree, but still reduce the reconstruction cost for a particular version.
So you can think of it in this way: if it is not a merge, then a tree must be the optimal solution. Right, because
I'm not sure.
because you can think of it in this way: if you can retrieve the highest, so first in terms of the storage cost, right? Yeah. If you delete one edge, then the storage cost must be reduced, right? And the second thing is if you, in terms of the recreation cost, if you can retrieve a smaller recreation cost for this particular version using one edge instead of the other one, then basically you can remove the other edge, right? Because there is no need to add this other edge.
And that edge will not be used for other versions.
Yeah, it will not be used because it is like a shortest path problem.
Yes.
So it is a suboptimal. So if this version has the optimal recreation cost, then it's like descendant must be having a optimal cost for this particular version. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess for that particular formulation, I'm not sure. So I'm asking whether there are any other variations in formulations which would be arbitrary.
So as I mentioned, the only violation is that if you consider merge instead of storing each version as the modification from one particular version, then tree must be the optimal structure. Yeah, for all of the definitions. Yes.
Actually, I'm really sorry to interrupt. No, we have to give up the room a little bit early. So how about this? Let Silo finish, hold your questions till the end, and whatever time we have at the end we'll use for questions. Sorry, but I want to make sure she can finish her talk. Sorry about that.
Yeah, thank you. So we have talked about the OrpheusDB and also the generalized storage representation. So the overall takeaway here is that with only a lightweight layer on top of traditional database, we can enable effective data versioning, and we can enable data scientists to reason across different versions. And the second takeaway is that with very simple but very efficient algorithm, we can optimize the performance a lot. So in both the OrpheusDB and the generalized storage representation part, we observed that with smaller increase in the storage, we can reduce the checkout time dramatically. And the third thing is, for different settings, we may require different algorithm for it. For example, for OrpheusDB, we are using record level deduplication. But for the generalized storage representation, we are using a delta-based approach. So in the following, I will briefly talk about some of the other works that I have been done during the course of my PhD study. So I'm also involved in lots of the interactive data exploration projects. So where we want to find fast response time for each different queries. So in particular, I studied two different visual queries, which are two parts. Which are parts of the Zen with Sage project inside our group. For the first one, we want to fast identify the feature pairs that can explain the separability given two different sets. And the second one is, given a histogram, we want to find the matched histogram in a fast manner. And in addition to the visual query, I also work on aggregate queries during my internship here in the MX group. In addition, I also worked on automatic data extraction from logs, where we want to find patterns inside the log dataset and try to extract the structured format from the unstructured logs, as well as the auto machine learning for large-scale data set, where we basically draw the intuition from approximate query processing and applied here into the auto ML. The last one is from my internship in Google, where we want to do the table synthesis and table compression, and where we try to apply deep learning techniques to do the attribute ranking. At last, I will conclude with some of the future works that can be potentially done. So but the first thing is, in addition to the data versioning, we are also having the model versioning during the iterative process. And can we build some tools to help data scientists to inspect the model and check how model evolves in an efficient manner, such that, for example, the users can ask queries like, what is the data slice that this model performs worst? And also what is why this model degrades when the time evolves? So the goal here is that we want to fast forward the result to different queries instead of letting the users to examine it in a brute force way. Also, in addition to the data versioning, we may want to build a management system that is an end-to-end data science lifecycle. So we want to include not only the data, but also the code, as well as different models, such that we can capture all different informations, or as you mentioned, like the different provenance informations. And so that the data scientists can better reason about the workflow and the data and the model. More broadly, I'm also interested in developing tools to make data science simpler and more efficient in different stages of the whole life cycle. Yeah. that's pretty it. Thank you.
All right, let's thank the speaker. And now you can ask questions until they kick us out.
Yes.
Yes, so I have some clarification questions about the black box div work. So one thing is that you mentioned about when you grow the graph, you sort of start from one version and branch to delta to other versions. So if the delta plus the original data together, the size is more than the full size of the version, would that make sense to start another head so that you can start from multiple versions and grow the graph?
So there must be a triangle inequality. Like if you materialize this version, then it will be the smallest cost. And if you're starting with some other existing version and then use the delta to basically trace the path from the materialized version to this particular version, then the cost must be bigger than the cost when materialized this version.
But this can happen, right? Like it's better to materialize this version instead of adding delta from another version.
What do you mean by a number of different versions?
Oh, so for example, if you have version 3, which goes from version 1 plus delta of version 2 and delta of version 3.
Yes.
If the cost of materializing version 3 is cheaper than those steps, would that make sense to just materialize the version 3?
Yeah, there is a constraint of the storage cost, right? So because of the constraint of storage cost, you may not be able to materialize all the versions. So you can only store the delta instead of materialize these particular versions. So basically inside this problem, there are two parts. The first part is which versions should be materialized. And then for the others that is not materialized, which delta should I store? So which versions should I store the delta on, right? So that's are the two major problems inside this problem.
The other question is that in the example you mentioned, you can actually version 1 can be version 2 plus a delta. Do you assume you can actually have an older version that is grow based on our newer version?
The older version that will result in a new version. So basically, you have an old version and you have a new version, and then if this old version is evolves, then it will result in a new version.
Yeah, because I was thinking about whether this is more like a rebalancing scheme you incur periodically to restructure your data, or is that goes with the process when you're creating new versions? Because it seems like during the process of creating new version, after adding a new version, you actually have limited choice of how to materialize this new version, right? So it's more like you have the full freedom to actually compute a new graph with all the versions.
Yeah, so basically the question is it a repack problem or an online maintenance problem, right? So for example, in the previous part, we are considering the online maintenance, and then we can do the repack periodically. So basically you can, as you mentioned, you only have very restricted choices, and then you can use a suboptimal solution. And then basically you can try to repack it periodically. Same for this one. So you can first make a decision of storing it in as a modification, or you can, so basically if you look at the algorithm, it is also so you can think of it as an intermediate step. And then you can do, periodically, and then reorganize this tree into a more optimized one.
I see. And then if this is the case, you might also, the algorithm can also consider the cost of migration from one structure to another structure.
Yes.
So to do these algorithms, do you need the deltas between all pairs of versions already computed for you?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So currently in our experiments, we are basically calculate within 10 hops instead of all the delta matrix. But it's basically depends on how good you want it to be. So there is a trade-off calculating the deltas among different versions. So in our experiment, we constrained it into 10 hops.
So So to do that calculation, you materialize every version and compute all the deltas to all those materialized versions. Or do you, when you check it in, you compute all the deltas at that moment? Or I guess it doesn't matter.
Yeah. So basically, you can choose to like calculate in the after you commit it. Yeah. So first, because when you commit it, you may want to like do it in a very fast phase. So basically, you can try to compute the delta between this version with one particular version, and then commit it immediately. And then after the commit process, you can do repack. And then you can try to compute more deltas and then try to do the repack. Yeah.
And can you, do you ever use like, is it possible to compute a delta from two delta, like you have two deltas, and obviously you could always just concatenate the deltas, but is there any assumption that you could, or any advantage if you could just compute a new delta based on these two deltas that might be smaller than?
So there is like, as I mentioned, there is triangle inequality, right, among like these three versions. But there is not like, you cannot estimate exactly what this delta will be.
Right.
Right.
But there's no access to say, here's two sequential deltas, give me a new delta. It would actually have to just materialize it and recompute the delta.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
I was wondering about the overall story. Like when you say compare OrpheusDB with something stupid and available as Git, what do I get? I mean, why would I use it? Am I going for it for better storage, better checkout time? I mean, what's the higher order story?
So for OrpheusDB, the higher storage is like as the starting point. I can show you the interview with the MIT group in biologist. Maybe this way would be faster. Oops. So the starting point is this one. So the starting point is basically when we talk to some of the computational biology groups, and they are saying that they are wasting lots of time, lots of money in the storage.
Okay, this is great. So what's the OrpheusDB counterpart to this? I mean, what will we get with OrpheusDB?
So the first thing that is, as I mentioned, like you can have a compact storage, right? The second thing is you can. So as I mentioned, like you can set a budget for the storage consumption. You can set the budget to like 2 times of the smallest possible storage. Yeah. So it depends on like how you set the budget. And then the second thing is because of you have lots of metadata recorded, and you know like the version graph. So basically when you want to do some analysis, you can, based on the information that is maintained inside this system. And the other thing is, for example, you want to do analysis across different versions. For example, in the data science scenario, you may want to see what is the version that has the highest accuracy on some particular data slice, like in the US. And then you can easily issue like SQL-like queries to answer these ones. So basically, you can think of it as like enables the versioning capability, and also you can do the advanced querying capability, analytics across different versions, and check versions, and also identify version that is satisfying some certain property. Yeah, and meanwhile you will have a very compact storage.
So do you have an idea for, like, for instance, this data set? You mentioned that it's 100,000 per year to curate this data set. So, like, what would Orpheus reduce it to roughly? If you used Orpheus's techniques, do you know how this number?
We didn't particularly done the experiment on this one, but it basically depends on like how many versions, how they are similar to each other. So for example, here, the 20 to 30 students, and each time when they do some analysis, they make a private copy, then obviously this one can be reduced, right?
I think it would be interesting if we compare to like how Git does, right?
How Git does,
Yeah.
right? So yes, Git also use like delta-based approach. And for example, in this one, we only consider 100 versions. And this is a Linux fork dataset. And we can see the Git will take around 200 megabytes. And while ours, just in terms of the storage cost, not in terms of the recreation cost, we can see like our one is like around 160 megabytes, right?
Is that an interesting problem, right? Do you have any more feedback that you've gotten from other users of your system on like where it's useful and what they encountered?
Sure. So basically, we led the biologist teams in our university to try it. So some of them find like the advanced querying capability is very useful. And while some like they don't want to use the system or they are reluctant to use the system because they need to basically change their behavior. So they need to like every time when they generate a new version, they need to commit and check out the version. And another thing is, as I mentioned, we only care about like the dataset versioning. So it's not like an overflow of the both data and code and the models. So they feel it is very restricted. So it cannot capture all the meta information unless the user can like manually type in the meta information into the system. They don't want to like manually type in all the meta information. They want to have an automatic way to have them capture all different informations. Yeah. And also we get contacted by some, I think the Generalized research from Virginia. And what they want to do is they want to do the neuroscience annotation. So they basically first use deep learning to annotate the figures, and then they will need to do human proofreading of each problematic area. And they said it will be very useful for them to consider different versions and support the advanced querying capabilities. Yeah.
So let's pretend that this was in production in some kind of enterprise environment that was holding PII, and someone issued a GDPR request that required backing out some information from. So I imagine that the way that would work would probably by swapping out the immutable versions of records with where the backed out information got masked. Would there still be a capability to recognize that between versions 1 and version 2 of some particular record that a particular field had been changed, even though the actual values in those fields might no longer be present in the canonical versions of the records that are being stored? Or, I mean, how do you envision supporting something like a GDPR request for a system like this?
So I'm not very familiar with the GDPR request. Can you explain?
Depending on where data is stored, there's a law in particular in Europe that a lot of large organizations have adopted that requires that anyone holding on to personal data has the capability to back out that data if the people who are subjected to it request it. So if you were living in France, you could contact Google and say, I want you to flush everything about me out of your system. So if someone wanted to have their data cleared out of all versions of some record, I imagine that's something that's not supported now, but do you imagine, do you have any ideas how that might be something that the system could be augmented to support?
I see. So basically, if we want to flush a particular record, right, then basically, I guess you can simply find those records and then try to remove those records, and then accordingly, you can update the versioning information from the version table. Yeah.
So, did you also compare with offline optimals in your paper, or it was too expensive to compute the offline optimals because you're using greedy algorithms and all, right?
We do compare. I didn't show it here, but in the paper we do consider the integer. We formulate it as an integer linear programming problem, and then we compare the greedy algorithm with the linear integer programming method. But that one is basically, we are using some software, and it cannot scale up to it can scale to very small size. And then we compare the optimal one with our algorithm. It actually performs very well. Yeah.
And there was another question I'm following up on that. So the starting point you said was 10 hop information about the deltas, right? For the second word, you said you need 10 hop information about the deltas to start.
Yes.
So is it like, did you vary that experiment? Like if you had only 5 hop information and 10 hop information, is the impact of having more information there in the empirical version? Theoretically, I know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
do you have an experiment like that?
We didn't conduct the experiments on constrain the number of hops into 5. So in our experiment, we basically set it as 10. But yes, if the number of deltas is smaller, then obviously it will affect the algorithm. Yeah, because you will have less search space or constrained search space. Yeah.
I'm just curious that empirically, is it like maybe 3 hop information is enough to give you same result, or there is an incremental approach possible that you start with a 3 hop information, come up to some solution, and then see if you need more information.
Right. That's a valid point. Yeah. But we didn't try it.
Yeah. Also, maybe you can make use of the triangle inequality as upper bounds for the delta that you haven't computed, and if you see the upper bound is very small enough, then maybe you can use that to avoid some computation.
Right.
Of long hop.
That is a valid one. Yeah.
So I think I would imagine for a collaborative effort on a dataset, merge will be actually a very essential functionality. But over the course of the talk, you didn't talk about merge at all. So is that done in your paper, or you haven't gone to merge yet?
Yeah, we do very simple mechanism for merge. So currently what we are doing is basically we trace this version back to its common ancestor of these two versions. And then we figure out whether there is a conflict in terms of each record. If there is a conflict, then we basically use so when you merge two versions, you will have specify V1 and V2. And then if we inspect there is a conflict, we simply use V2 to overwrite the record inside V1. So that is, we first report to the user that there is a conflict. If they want to do the merge, still want to do the merge, then we will simply overwrite it. Yeah, but we have some ongoing work on how to do the conflict resolution inside this space. Yeah.
The lineage,
yes.
tracking the lineage will be important.
Yes. Right.
For the black box approach, it's hard to see how to merge.
Yes. Exactly. Right.
All right. No more takers. Then let's thank Zilu again.
Thank you.